Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. If you're a beginner or intermediate Unreal Engine user and want to learn how to export assets like meshes and textures into Blender, you're in the right place. Today, I'll walk you through the basics of this pipeline from exporting an asset in Unreal Engine to setting it up in Blender with proper materials and textures. For this tutorial, we're using a beautiful maple tree from the Megascans library, which is currently free but won't be after 2025, so grab it while you can. By the end of the video, you'll have confidence to export and recreate assets in Blender, maintaining the same visual quality as Unreal. So let's dive in. Now before we jump into the process, let's cover a few key points. In this tutorial, we're focusing on the essentials of the Unreal to Blender workflow. I'll show you how to export both the meshes and its textures, set up materials in Blender to watch Unreal's, match Unreal's look, and address some of the challenges you might face along the way. We'll be using Blender cycles to achieve better visual quality, and I'll explain how texture maps from Unreal work, including how blending between textures translate into Blender's shader editor. Now, the example asset we're using is a Norway maple tree, comes from the Megascans library, which anyone can access for free right now. I highly recommend downloading this asset soon, as they won't remain free starting 2025. So this pipeline will be useful for any Megascans or other Unreal assets you want to work with, so you're not stuck with the Megascans, obviously. Now, all right, with that said, let's just get started. For this particular tutorial to be as effective as possible, we are going to use a more complicated mesh to export from Unreal Engine over into Blender. That's why we're doing these Norway maple trees. Now, if we look onto the fab place, the page that we can get it from, Norway maple, you will notice that these are very high fidelity trees, and we should be able to use these in Blender if we would like, or we should be able to bring them into Blender to modify and then bring them back into Unreal Engine. And I think this particular asset is going to make much of a big difference for people to fully understand the process, because it has multi-layer structure. So it has like a trunk over here that has its own material, and then it has the leaves themselves, which obviously are meant to be very simplified, sort of like clumps of meshes. So if we switch over from a lit to a wireframe view, you'll notice what these look like effectively and what the trunk looks like from a geometry point of view. So this is really, really interesting. It does come with LODs as well, if I remember correctly. But anyway, the idea would be that when we export, we need to also take its textures, and this is going to be fundamental for us to understand just what really makes this tree and how we can replicate it back into Blender. So we can now start by having a look first at its material composition. Straight off the bat, we notice that we have a two-sided foliage for the leaves. Then we have a Norway tileable texture. I believe this might be, again, for something to do with the trunk. This is the trunk. There's some decoration in here. And what they mean by decoration is things like these points over here like that, like I don't know, let's call them bruises onto the tree trunk. And then they also have this imposter, which is something to do more with the, imagine something very, very far away. So maybe like, I don't know, a prop or maybe a billboard, right? So that's what that is for. But what we're interested in is the leaves, the trunk, and perhaps the decoration in there as well. Okay, so when we open the material, so we double click it and this will open a material instance, we can bring this over into the bar over here, and then we can click the hierarchy, and we have two options, which is the MA foliage and the Norway maple. Now, if I go on the MA foliage, this actually takes me to the material itself. This is the material that makes this tree tick, and it's got a option for the trunk, leaves, and decoration. Now all of a sudden these are like material functions within a very complicated shader, and this is going to put a lot of people off because they have no idea what the hell they're looking at, right? Now if we go back into the material instance and we click on hierarchy, we can also click this one, Norway maple, which opens another material instance. So this is very, very confusing. Now, things don't have to be that confusing because we fortunately have a tool to show us most things where they are. So if we go back to our tree and we actually right click it in here, let's say we want to export this tree, we can actually click this button here where it says browse to asset. And this will take our entire, content browser over to where this asset is located. And if we right click it, we can actually click on export. So asset actions and then click export. But before we do that, make sure that Nanite is disabled, because if Nanite is enabled, which by the way, this might be an indicator that this does not have any LODs, it's just simply the tree itself. Now, if Nanite is enabled and you export this out, it will not export properly for Blender, for example. Your geometry will be completely wrong. So disable Nanite, and this will take a bit of time for it to recompute the entire tree. But once that is completed, you can then move on to the next step, which is actually exporting the mesh as an FBX or whatever file format you'd like. So with Nanite disabled, and you'll notice that there's a star here if it's been disabled, because it tells you that this mesh has been modified last. If you go over here again, you will see that Nanite is disabled. You can also double click it, which will open the tree in this viewport, and then we can ensure that over here where it says enable Nanite support, it's disabled as well. Okay, back to our viewport. So when you right click the tree and you go to asset actions, you can actually press the export button to take the tree out of Unreal Engine, or you can press the migrate button if you want to take this tree and move it to another project in Unreal Engine, but that's not the topic that we're covering today. So we're going to click on the export button, which will then open this page. Now you can drop this wherever you want, so it really depends on wherever you want to drop it. So I'm just going to put it in here. I'm going to make a new folder, tutorial tree, maybe something like that, and then if I open it, I can actually click save in here, but it will ask me, what do I want to save it as? Do I want to save it as an FBX, a whatever GL transmission, or object file OBJ? Now most people will use OBJ or FBX, so we're going to go for FBX for this time around, but just bear in mind that OBJ is also an option. Now when we do the FBX, I'm going to press save. This FBX export option will show up. Then pretty much in here, you don't really have to do much. You don't really have to click on anything unless there is something specific that you'd like. Like for example, do you want to export the collision of this? Do you want to export the level of detail if there's any LODs for it, or the vertex color that might have been baked inside Unreal Engine? Now, normally you just don't really do anything here, just press export. But some people might like disable collision. Maybe you'll want to make your own collision later or something like that. It's really up to you. You will have to probably delete the collision if that gets exported out of Unreal, if it's getting in, if it looks weird or awkward in Blender. So I'm just going to press export just to do it like that. And this shouldn't take long for this particular tree, but once the export is done, you will be able to see the viewport sort of like resumes playback, so you know that it's pretty much finished, just like it did now. But you can also right click and obviously do an asset action export and choose in here OBJ and then press save. And I don't think it's even going to ask you anything for this. I think it just simply is going to do it once you press the export. And yeah, you have it. It's just simply exporting as an OBJ. Generally, the OBJ file is also higher in terms of space required on disk as opposed to the FBX. Now, before we get into setting up materials in Blender, it's important to manage expectations about what can be and what can be reproduced in Blender, sorry. Unreal Engine has advanced material functions like, alpha dithering, complex material blends, or even custom functions that simply don't have direct equivalents in Blender. So while you can't replicate everything one-to-one, it's still possible to get very close in terms of the overall look and feel. For most marketplace assets, including Megascans, the basics are quite straightforward. You'll typically have a base color, a normal map, roughness, ambient occlusion, metallic maps. These are easy to connect to Blender's shader editor, and I'll walk you through how to do that step by step. However, things like advanced blending techniques or procedural elements unique to Unreal, they won't translate perfectly. Covering all these nuances would require an entirely separate video, and even then it's not always practical to recreate every detail. So for this tutorial, we'll focus on the essentials and show you how to achieve a great result that closely resembles the original look in Unreal Engine. And if we go into Blender to open our files, so I'm just going to actually search for Blender and I'm going to bring it in. If we import this mesh into Blender, you'll notice that we actually will not have any textures. So let me just do that and you'll be able to see. Now, the importing is quite straightforward. You just, we're going to delete everything in this scene. Going to press the file, import, and we're going to select the FBX option. And now we need to go into the folder where we've actually saved that. So for me, it's going to be somewhere in here, tutorial tree, there we go. And I can actually select this and I can actually press import FBX without changing anything in here. Just simply select the import FBX, and this will bring the tree over after it's finished calculating. Once that's finished, you will be able to see the tree in all of its glory, and as well as, like what I said to you before, this bit here, which is actually the collision. So you can see, you will know it's a collision because it's Unreal CX, UCX. This is actually a collision, okay? Or it could be the part where it's like a billboard or whatever, but I'm telling you that this here is the collision. We're not going to bother with that. We're actually going to just delete it. But what we have in here, you'll notice, is that we have this mesh, and then there's another mesh. You know what I mean? So these are LODs that are in there, and you'll notice that you got LOD 0 all the way to 6. Okay. Now what we're going to do is going to select these, and we can actually hide them all, right? And just keep the main one, which is LOD 0, meaning the highest quality. We're going to do that because this one uses the same material structure, you'll notice in here, as all the other ones in there. So you've got the two-sided foliage, you've got the trunk, which are in the decoration. These are the ones that we're really interested in, right? In the two-sided foliage, the trunk, and the decoration. But all of these other ones will effectively have the same materials. So once you update one of them, all the rest will be updated as well based on those LODs. Okay, now it's time for us to bring our textures, because if we switch over from this viewport shading to this one here, you'll notice that there will potentially be no textures that have been brought over with the mesh. And as you can see, it's not really turned into any particular color or anything like that. And that's because when we open a new panel in here and switch over to shader, we will not see any particular any texture added to this. So we need to bring our texture over, but where do we get them from? So switching back to Unreal Engine, we can go back to our material instance in here, and if we scroll down, we should be able to find our textures. And depending on the project and how it's set up, the stuff from Quixel is generally set up quite nicely. You'll notice that this one is an albedo, which is the color basically of the leaves. Then we have another mask, which has got opacity on the R channel, roughness on the G channel, and translucency on the B channel, so the RGB, right? And then we have the normal. Now this is quite nice because it actually tells us that. And if you, by the way, if you want to know how you can get these labels for your texture slots in Unreal Engine, this is quite simple. So if you go into any shader in Unreal Engine and type in texture sample, so this will be the one that loads up effectively loads up the texture. You won't be able to see anything in here to modify, but if you right click it and convert it to a parameter, then you get these channel names. So if you type in here opacity, for example, you'll notice that now you get this this changed over here like that, so you know that the red channel has the opacity. Now this is quite useful for structuring, but more importantly, this is also going to be visible in the material instance in here if you make those modifications. So it's just a neat little trick that I wanted to show you. Now if we have a look again over here, we're going to click this button over like that, and this takes us to the textures for the trees. And this is just for the leaves themselves. So if we select all these textures and click, right click and then select asset actions and bulk export, so not export, but bulk export, we can now save this into the same folder that we added the tree. And once that's done, the textures are generally quite instant to be exported, although it seems to be still taking a bit of time for me right now. There we go. Now it's finished. Now, bear in mind, you don't want to leave Unreal Engine. You want to keep it because you're going to use the information that you're reading in here to set up the material in Blender. So if we go back into Blender, we want to bring those particular textures in. So we can look for a texture image. So image texture or whatever it's called in Blender, and we can click the open button in here, and then we have to actually navigate to the same folder as before where I've saved the textures. You'll notice that Unreal Engine, when you bulk export, it will create this sort of like texture this structure of a folder, and you have to like go all the way down to the root until you get to where you need to get to. And these are the free textures, so we can double click this one and that will be the base color. Now straight off the bat, if I put into the base color, you'll be able to get some leaves. But these leaves are not masked, so you can see in there, if we get quite close, these leaves look horrible because there's no way for us to kind of blend away this extra fat on the leaves. So for us, we need the opacity in order to do that. So I'm going to duplicate this. So Shift D to duplicate, and then duplicate it again. And at this point, we can now load the next map in here. So I'm going to click on this folder and select the mask. And then this one, I'm going to check this folder again and change to normal. Once I have this, I can connect the normal over into the normal map in here. This is a normal node, so if you don't have it, just make sure that you add it in. Sorry, don't put into the strength, put into the color, right? Like that. And obviously now you can control the normal of that. And already we're seeing a bit more of a better shading in here just by doing it. And then we can take this, which is the mask. Now, considering if we go back to Unreal Engine, this kind of tells us what each channel is. So G for roughness, B for translucency, and B for opacity. Now, let's think about how we can get these channels out, because it's not like they're going to be in the alpha. That's not going to serve us. So what we want to do is we want to add a separate XYZ, right? Let me just see that separate color one. You can see in here, there's also this, right? Bear in mind that all of these does the same thing, right? The separate XYZ and this one is the same thing. Now, I think the separate color is a newer node because it didn't exist before. So people used to use the XYZ one, which is a vector that, if you think about X would be R, I would be G, and Z would be the B value, right? The blue. So let's just use a separate color. We can put a color like that in there. One thing, we have this alpha. So if we put the red channel into the alpha, you'd think that this would fix it. Unfortunately, it doesn't. And you can tell by the fact that it's called black all over. And the reason why that's not working is because over here where you have the blend mode, you have to change this from opaque to alpha clip. And once you do that, voila, we now have the leaves showing up as in Unreal Engine. Now, this is not using a opacity mask sort of situation. This is actually using a blend, right? So it's more expensive here than it is in Unreal Engine with the opacity mask, but that's fine. You know, we can work with that. Now we have two more maps. We've obviously got the green for roughness, so you can actually put that into the roughness channel in there, and then you have blue, you know, for transmission, so we can have a look at using that as well. Again, these leaves seem to be a bit too shiny, so we're going to have to look into that as well. Speaking of nanite tessellation, my WorldForge project is now on Patreon. The beta version has just released, and it has all the bells and whistles for an auto material that would really take your scenes to the next level. This auto material is going to get constant updates, and I'm currently improving loads of other things. It supports water puddles, lava rivers, stylized features. Is able to blend 6 different materials. You're able to use nanite tessellation. All the meshes added to it can perfectly blend with a nanite environment. It has a winter map, a volcanic map, a stylized map. Honestly, it's like full pack of features, and the shader itself is very performant as well. It runs with all the new technology, let's say, that's found in Unreal Engine. It will also feature stamps, PCG, and foliage generating abilities in the near future. So check it out on Patreon if you'd like. I think for the price of a coffee, you effectively get access to it straight away. Okay, so the first thing I want to also do before I move on with fixing the actual roughness and making sure that we get our translucency. I keep saying transmission, but I wanted to say translucency. What we want to do is we want to switch over from EV to cycles because we want to see it, you know, in its proper glory like it looked in Unreal Engine. So I'm going to switch over from the EV engine to the cycles engine. Just make sure you're on GPU compute over here, and also change over into render mode. Now, once you do that, you won't be able to really see anything because you don't really have any lighting, okay? Now, this can be easily rectified by adding a sun. So go to light and add the sun. But I don't really like how it looks with this sun. You know, the sun is it's just not great, right? You know, you have to put a large intensity on it, and it looks quite flat, and honestly, I just don't like how the leaves and everything else performs with this sun. We can actually improve our sun by using some other, you know, one other type of sun. So we're going to delete this, and instead going to go to the world material over in here, and I'm going to type in sun. Sorry, no, I'm going to type in sky. And using the sky texture with the Nishita set to on, I'm going to put that into the color like that. And all of a sudden, we get a nicer sun effectively that looks a lot more realistic. And this also brings our particular maple here closer to Unreal Engine. Okay, now switching back over to the shader editor, the normal shader editor, we're going to go to our tree again, and I'm going to add a math node right in here. So I'm going to drop it into the green channel like that, and I'm going to switch this over to a multiply, and I'm going to put this into a 0. Maybe 0.5 or something like that. Just reduce that roughness a bit more. I think, actually, no, sorry, not 0.5, 10. So I'm going to push it over to 10 so that we can reduce that roughness because it was definitely too strong. And now we can use the blue channel over into our subsurface over here. I'm going to put the translucency into the weight of this. And now we do get the translucency as well. So if we go underneath here, maybe something like that, you will be able to basically get a look on the translucency. I'm just trying to find a good angle for you to be able to see it. Let me just get into something like that. And I'm also going to switch over. Actually, before I switch over to the sky, make sure the normal itself is set to a non-colored over here, like that as well, because that's actually how this texture should be. And also this one here as well, this should be a non-colored as well, meaning that these are black and white. Actually, I think actually depending on the, no, this would need to be sRGB purely due to the setup that it contains the subsurface and all that stuff as well. Okay, now let me just check on this translucency, sorry, on this roughness. Maybe a 5 would be better, because it used to be like a 1, but I think that was way too shiny. Maybe like a 5, that would be great. And then I'm going to change over to the world in here, and we are able to change some stuff, like for example, the sun size or the sun intensity, right? So we can make the sun more intense. I think that's way too much, so probably maybe a 5. Over in here, we can change this. Again, it's set to a 1 or a 0.5 or something like that. But we can obviously, play around with the dust, with the ozone, with the air, if we want to, again, change some more settings. Now let's have a look. There we go. I think this looks closer and closer to the Unreal Engine material. But again, this is what that setup would look like when brought over to Blender, right? Now we don't have the trunk done yet, so we need to look at that. I am going to now select the tree, keep the tree selected, go back to my shader, to my object, and then with the tree selected, I can go to the material, check the trunk in here, and this is where the point where we need to add the rest of the texture. So going back to Unreal Engine, if I can find it, there we go, right, Unreal Engine. Now we can go to this particular node, the MA foliage. I'm going to double click the trunk and just have a look. See, the trunk is loading up the material, this textures from here, but none of them are showing because they're done through the material instance. So that's why when you go to the material instance in here, you need to look at the textures for the trunk as well. Now this is going to be difficult because they're not actually here. Even if you have to actually click over like that, double click to open the material instance for the trunk, and you'll be able to see it like this, and you can click the the magnifying glass, and you'll be able to find the texture. Now again, you can right click these, go to asset and export, bulk export, and we're going to do in the same folder. So select the folder, and that's now done. We can go back into Blender and add the rest of the textures. So again, image texture in here, click on the open button, and you will have to constantly go back into where you save those textures, otherwise you won't be able to find them. And gonna go to the trunk side, and these are the textures. So I'm gonna do the albedo here. Hopefully I've opened the albedo. Shift D to duplicate. So we're going to do the same setup of what we did before. So I'm just going to skip that, just do the setup of the previous material, just so we don't have to waste time on this. And one thing that you'll notice once you start adding the trunk, especially, is that the material seems to be like cutting off. And that means that you also need to take the, do the tileable and also do the decoration, because the tileable is what they use to effectively do the rest of the trunk itself, like where the branches are and everything like that. But just this bit here is only done by, trunk 01, while the tileable is what they do for the rest of the branches in order to maintain sort of like a better, I guess, tileable texture across the whole tree. So you do want to do that. Now, also very important, sometimes if the the light is too strong coming into the scene, like hitting the tree itself, then you may want to decrease that. And again, things like the transmission, if that doesn't show up very well through these leaves, then what you want to do is go back to your two-side material in here, like maybe like that. And when you see just imagine the radius as an RGB, so you might want to set that to a 0 and then push the green, because you might want to see these leaves as green from underneath. But just make sure that you don't overdo it, because like right now I have definitely overdone it. So maybe like a 1. I think you'd probably need to look for like the settings of what would be predominantly the color for translucency for this, because what you want to do is ensure that your subsurface is kind of following the reality, for what these leaves specifically should have as a subsurface color. And again, we're using cycles right now, so you might want to also test this with Eevee see if you enjoy that more. And, you know, obviously switching over from cycles to Eevee is just a click of a button. Nishita won't really work very well with Eevee, just so you are aware. And then the roughness values and everything like that is going to be different. So you may want to switch, you know, turn down the roughness if you're going to be using Eevee. And again, the whole thing will look different in Eevee as opposed to cycles, which is a superior rendering method if you're looking at offline. So again, this is why Unreal Engine is obviously ahead of the game when it comes to real-time rendering, because it looks, the tree in cycles looks as good in Unreal Engine as it does here. So it's and that's in real time, right? Okay, now going back to our particular problem with the trunk that I was talking about, you want to do once you do the trunk, you also want to do the tileable here. So effectively, once you've done your nodes, in Unreal Engine they also use an opacity for the trunk, but you can't actually link this to the alpha in Blender cycles because this will cause all sorts of issues, like you can see here with opacity. So you don't want to use that. That's more for, as I said, for Unreal Engine, where they're using the opacity mask. But we can actually select these nodes and click copy in here and go over to our tileable, click paste. We obviously need to load up the textures for this. So we can click over here and go up, and we want to go into our tileable and select the albedo there. And again, we want to do this for the mask and then for the normal as well. Otherwise, we obviously will not get the right textures for this. So again, the mask, and this is going to be for the normal. And obviously, I'm going to skip the other one, the decoration. I'm just going to do it without showing you guys because I think you get the idea. Just make sure you always change from sRGB to a non-color when it comes to normal maps or displacement or things like that. That's going to be quite important for you to do. Now we're going to add the color over here as well for the albedo of the trunk. That should already fix most of our issues, and you can see that it has. Now I am most likely going to be noticing some particular problems with between the roughness, and perhaps I'm going to use this in the subsurface over here like that as well. The problem that we're noticing when we get to, let me just try and get very close. I think I may have I not disabled the, oh sorry, I didn't take the alpha out. There we go. Right, now that's done. Now here's the thing, in Unreal Engine they resolved this particular issue. They resolved it. So in Unreal Engine they resolved it by doing some sort of blending here. While in Blender, the Blender blending isn't going to help us too much with this particular problem. So yeah, that's definitely a bit of an issue that you want to look into. Now, generally, this could be a problem around tiling. So what we can do is select all of these. Well, actually, not select all of them, just select one of them and press Ctrl-T to get a texture and mapping coordinate. And then this vector could also link to the mask, and it can also link to the normal. And what this means is that now we can actually tile this more on whichever size, whichever sort of like axis we need to. Obviously without the z-axis that won't really do much, but what you want to kind of do is tiling it such a way that we're kind of getting a nice blend there, but you're not really going to get to a point where it's like perfectly blending. And this is where, as I said, the material setup in Unreal Engine is the one that works best using the opacity masks. And I think switching over to Eevee will allow you to kind of use the material as over here where it says opaque. You can actually switch over to an opaque clip, and then you're able to like use this opacity from here right into the alpha, and you can see there, right, it's already helped, right? And if we select the other material, which is the trunk, okay, and we can switch this over to alpha hashed as well, and take this and put it into the alpha, and that, oh, right, this doesn't work at all. So it seems it's only for the tileable that works. But you can see that we've effectively removed that seam. Let me just get to what it was. All right, this is so weird, right? We've got to switch this over to opaque, and yeah, let's go back to our tileable here. So it still creates issues, like when we do it, they're effectively only doing a blend right about here that fixes our issue. And as you can see, when you bring it back, it shows up everywhere, but then this seam is showing up. When you connect it into the alpha, that fixes the seam over here, but it creates this particular problem here, right? And that's because, again, we don't have the blend from Unreal Engine found in Blender. But if you do go in here, if you go to the material default lint trunk and you have a look at the branch blending, that's what it's called over here, and you can see it's using things like the R channel. Well, actually, it's using, let me just have a look. I said this is the branch blending. I need to see which one is the point where it sort of like connects the tileable textures. So potentially might be in here. I'm not really sure. It's really depending on where they're doing the blend. But that's what I'm saying is they are doing a blend. Oh yeah, I think this could be it. The decoration blending right here. Potentially. So maybe if we set up the decoration, maybe that's going to fix it. So let's have a look at that. So once I put all of that together, unfortunately, there's no real way to get the actual, as I said, the actual same alpha sort of situation that we do have in Unreal Engine with Blender. So you will be able to notice that sort of seam over here that just, you're probably gonna have to patch yourself up and correct it. There are ways to do this, obviously, but you know, giving from this distance, you really wouldn't be able to see it. Now, if we go back to Unreal Engine to try to search for this as well, over into the actual viewport, you know, just to get to the tree itself and just see if we can notice it, you'll look over here and, you know, really struggle to see it. I mean, it's happening right here, okay? You can actually kind of see it because they're using like a dither sort of opacity that they're doing. So again, when you look at it, it just sort of like seems it's not there, but it is there, right? And it's happening higher up here as well. We know wherever they're adding this particular, you know, these patches here, right? So if we can see those in Blender as well. If we get close to them, we'll be able to see them. There's one somewhere around here. I can't seem to be finding it at the minute, but I'm sure there was somewhere around here. I just love how, you know, let me just change over to Eevee because that's going to allow us to find it. There we go. You can see it, right? Right here in Blender, you can clearly see what it's at, but then in Unreal Engine, not so much. So effectively, you'd want to create a node graph inside of Blender to make sure that we get that kind of patched up so it's not so visible as it is in Blender, but that's where it is. Yeah, you know, I'm just pointing this out. This has nothing to do with actual export of textures from Unreal Engine to Blender. It's just simply how these two softwares operate differently. One thing that you can also do to make these leaves look better in Blender, by the way, you can go over to your render settings and switch over onto, sorry, not your render settings, your material for the leaves, and just go over to transmission and put that maybe to a 0.4, and they should allow for light to pass through the leaves as well, thus giving them a better, more natural look. Again, 0.4 might not be the right value here. You might need to be able to experiment a little bit more. I also like to put my, you know, like my roughness to a higher value as well. So again, just don't do it too much, but I think a 10 might be okay. But I think what it was before, like a 1 or a 0, I think that was pretty bad, to be honest. But again, it's really down to you, depending on your preference. But that's how you do it. Now, in terms of actually using this, let's say you've edited it. So you might have gone into Blender because you wanted to actually edit the tree, perhaps. So maybe you wanted to bend it or something like that. Obviously, this is, you know, bear in mind that you do also have these LODs that you might want to modify at the same time. But let's just say we've selected the tree over here from this point, something like that. And then we'll switch over to this, you know, this way of sort of like editing it using a radius. Okay. And hopefully this will allow me to now edit it because it's just kind of froze as I'm trying to, you know, do a selection and rotation. But once I do that, once I modify the shape of it, maybe I want to bring it into Unreal Engine when it's modified. So let me just go into this mode like that and see if I can actually edit it, because it's just simply seems to be freezing whenever I try to edit, which is not great, but it is what it is. So now you can see the awesomeness of my edit. Now, if I want to export this into, you know, bring it back to Unreal Engine, the first thing I want to make sure also is that it's actually keeping the size that we want. So I don't want this to be oversized or undersized or something like that. I just wanted to make sure that it fits within the Unreal Engine scale. So one thing that you can do is go back to your Unreal Engine project, make sure that over in here you can actually click on the add button and go to add feature content pack, and I will add the third person character in there, and I do actually have it. The idea would be that you export the third person character and you bring it over into your Blender file in order to put it near the tree. So from the folder the third person character, just double click the third person character itself, and this should open the blueprint that contains it, and you can select the mesh over here and you'll be able to see it like that. You know, I'm just right clicking and then clicking on the asset action and selecting export. I'm going to put this into the same place where I put everything else. I'm going to click save and then press export. Then back into Blender, going to go to file, import FBX, and I'm going to select the Quinn model, click on the import, and now you can see just how big Quinn is going to be as opposed to the tree. So this is fine. I actually like this. This is what I want. Also, the pivot point of the tree is down here. So the tree will rotate from that pivot point, which is fine. That means that it will be planted in the ground as it should be. But if the pivot point was somewhere around here, up here, or whatever, you'd want to reset it at the base into the 0 point of the world origin. So if you go to location, you can see that this tree is now in the 0 point of the world, which is great. And Quinn is obviously, you know, quite a tall lady over here, and she looks quite fine as, you know, versus the tree. Now, one thing that we can do is now we can export the tree, and let's say we're exporting it just on this LOD. We might be able to click Alt P and just say clear and keep transformation, which means that now we've just effectively extracted this tree out of all the LODs themselves. I can go to File, Export as an FBX, and I can put it in the same place that I put the previous stuff. So I can obviously name that as to something that's more appropriate, maybe tree mods. There we go. And before you press anything else, just make sure you do selected objects, otherwise you'll export the whole scene. And over here in the geometry, change the smoothing from normal only to face, and then just press export. But one thing before you do it, by the way, as another tip, you may want, with the tree selected, to press Control A, and then over here select all transforms, right? What it says, apply all transforms. Just press that before you press export, and this should help you to get the right scale, rotation, and everything else about this model. Now you can press export FBX, and it should take a bit of time because it's such a, you know, it's a big asset. Once it's done, you can go back into Unreal Engine, and you know, I'm just going to import it here. It's fine. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm going to click the import button. We go over to the folder where I have saved it, and I think I was seeing it actually, tutorial tree. I can select the tree mod and click on open. Now this should also bring the tree over with the materials. So over here on the FBX import options, I can make sure that I've got generate missing collision, so it creates a collision for the tree. I don't want to build Nanite this time around, at least not now. And it's going to ask me things like, you know, do I want to have a material on it or something like that, which is fine. You know, we can just press the import. You do have some more options in here, like import mesh LODs if you are exporting it with with LODs, combine meshes if there are multiple meshes in the same group. But I'm just going to click on the import button in here, and this shouldn't, you know, will probably take just as long as it did for Blender or whatever else to import. But once it's done, I think it will come with its own material already preset with the textures that we've just added. But this means that you might want to add the materials created in Unreal Engine for this tree for it to look as good as the tree in Unreal Engine before you exported it, right? So that should be fine. We haven't really modified anything about the UVs or anything like that. We just modified the shape of the tree, and we have effectively left the textures and everything else the same way. And now again, this import will take a bit of time, but it shouldn't take too long. Once it's done, you will notice that we have the tree and the textures brought in with the materials for it as well. So if we go back into our world in here, we can actually drop this tree right like that. And it's got the modification, as you can see. Let me just bring it out into the open a bit more. It's got the modifications. So it's got that bend that we did. You can see it there. It's such an odd bend. Obviously, this was done in a rush, but the entire shader kind of looks wrong, and that's because as I said, we need the setup of the other tree. So this is not that difficult to do because effectively, you can go over to, let's say, this material. and you can say, okay, I want to find this material, which is this, and we can then just drop it into these slots. And now the leaves are back to what they were, right? The leaves are fine. And it's the same thing here. So we want to bring the, where was it now? The maple decoration. So we can search for that. And that's great. We have it, and we can drop it in here. And now we have the right decoration. The next one was the tileable. So I'm going to search for that. And again, going to drop it into the tileable. And now we have that. And the last one was the trunk 01, which is this one. I'm going to find it, and I'm going to drop it in there. So now we have the material. There's a bit of problems here, as you can see, because of the movement. And again, this is because this tree has been modified in its shape. But I hope this idea of the tutorial, this kind of showcases how things can be exported and how they can go wrong, and what to expect and what not to do. So in essence, the reason why this is happening is because the double PO, the world position offset that's allowing this tree to swing around with the wind, is causing it to be messed up. So if you actually go to your, not the trunk, but the tileable in here, you'd probably want to look for something like the wind, right? And you'd want to deactivate it, because right now it does have wind activated by default. I'm not really sure effectively where you even disable it from here, but I'm sure there's a way to do it. I just need to look into further what's controlling that. What's controlling the actual wind to move around. In theory, if you control Z to replace these materials that we changed, we can see that it was in fact the tileable for sure that's causing it. But if I double click it, I need to find in here where are the settings, right, for the wind. So I think where it says animate foliage, if we disable that, potentially, yeah, it's done it. But now the decoration is moving, so we would again have to go into the decoration, and same thing, we go to animate foliage and deactivate it, and that should stop the wind making this particular tree move like that. Now again, the reason why it's not working anymore is because we changed this shape here fundamentally, and the WPO was not, the world position offset wind was not set up to work that way. It was only set up to work with a tree that's going upright like these. Okay, so that's why. But I hope you learned a valuable lesson here. Now, there's nothing quite so alien as to see a tree that moves its hips like this, right? This is some seriously snaky kind of motion in here, but this is the WPO functioning as intended, guys. When we change the shape of this tree, we've kind of turned into a snake and no longer a tree, as you can see. And that's a wrap on this tutorial. I hope this gave you a solid foundation for exporting assets from Unreal Engine and setting them up in Blender. If you found this helpful, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me out and ensures you won't miss future tutorials. I'll be releasing more content like this, diving into fundamental workflows and interconnectivity between apps like Unreal Engine, Blender, Substance Painter, things like that. These tutorials are designed to help you expand your skill set and make your creative pipelines smoother and more efficient. So thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Keep creating.